Good evening. Tonight, a look at what happened when things went very wrong in Tokugawa, Japan, and the remarkably creative lengths authorities went to in order to remind everyone else not to follow suit. If you'd like more of these, the subscribe button is somewhere nearby. And if you have a moment, let me know where you are and what time it is for you. Picture a fireplace across the room, its embers settling into a low, steady glow. Take a slow breath in. The warmth reaches you without effort. Another breath. The embers shift slightly, barely audible, and the air around you is still. One more. You're exactly where you need to be. Now we begin. You stand in the outer courtyard of a magistrate's office in Edo, mid-morning, early summer in the 1730s. The packed earth underfoot is dry and pale. A low wooden fence separates you from the main compound, where a man kneels with his hands bound behind him. Two officials in dark robes stand to either side, their faces carefully neutral. A clerk reads from a scroll, his voice flat and rapid, listing the offences: theft from a merchant's storehouse, attempted flight, refusal to name accomplices. An inkstone sits on a low table beside the clerk, next to a set of thin bamboo needles and a shallow dish of dark pigment. The clerk finishes. One of the officials steps forward and kneels beside the prisoner. He dips a needle into the ink, tests it once on a scrap of cloth, and leans in. The man does not move. You cannot see the design from where you stand, only the careful, deliberate motion of the official's hand, the way the prisoner's jaw tightens, the slow passage of minutes. When it is done, the official rises, wipes his hands, and the prisoner is led away. A single horizontal line now marks his forearm. Clean, permanent, unmistakable. Tokugawa authorities did not need dungeons or lengthy imprisonments to manage crime. Incarceration was expensive, and the state preferred punishments that marked the body, announced the transgression, and sent the offender back into society as a walking reminder. Tattooing criminals was standardized across the realm, though each domain selected its own symbols. Hiroshima favored the character for dog, C, placed prominently on the arm. Edo, seat of the shogunate, used a system of escalating horizontal lines, one for the first offense, a second added for the next, and so on. A glance told any merchant, employer, or neighbor what they needed to know. The marks could not be hidden easily, could not be removed, and required no ongoing expense to maintain. Some domains placed marks on the face, others preferred the inner arm or shoulder. Records from the period note regional variation, though the principle held constant. The body became the ledger, the skin the official record. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was administration, efficient and visible, and it worked because everyone understood what the marks meant. Heat presses down across the courtyard. Dust hangs in the air, slow to settle. The wood of the fence is warm to the touch, rough and split from years of sun. Breathe. You are still here, still safe. Beyond the merchant districts and the tidy wards where magistrates kept their records, the hierarchy that structured daily life in Tokugawa, Japan, ran on an engine of codified obligation. At the top sat the emperor in Kyoto, revered and powerless, his role ceremonial, his movements restricted. Real authority rested with the shogun in Edo, whose officials managed domains, collected taxes, enforced laws, and kept detailed registries of every household. Below them came the daimyo, regional lords who ruled their own territories but owed fealty, regular attendance at Edo, and hostages in the form of wives and heirs left behind while they traveled. Then the samurai, a hereditary warrior class that had largely stopped fighting by the mid-17th century and now filled administrative posts, collected stipends in rice, and obsessed over protocol. Beneath them, in descending order of social standing, came farmers, artisans, and merchants, the latter technically lowest despite often being wealthiest, a contradiction the system acknowledged and ignored. Outside the system entirely sat outcasts, the eater and hinin, who handled work considered ritually polluting, leather tanning, butchery, disposal of the dead, execution. No one debated this arrangement. It was understood, mapped onto family registries kept by temples, reinforced by sumptuary laws that dictated who could wear silk, ride in palanquins, or build two-story houses. And when someone within this structure failed to uphold their obligations, punishments reflected the offense and the offender's rank. A merchant caught in fraud faced confiscation of assets, public display, tattooing, exile. A samurai accused of embezzlement or dereliction faced something far more intimate. You are in a small room in a samurai compound, late afternoon, autumn. The walls are plain wood, the floor covered with fresh tatami mats that still smell faintly of rice straw. A single low table sits in the center, and on it a wooden stand holding a wakizashi, the short blade polished to a mirror finish, its handle wrapped in dark silk. Beside it, a sheet of white paper and a writing brush. Thin light filters through shoji screens. Outside, you hear nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no birds. The man kneeling at the table wears a white robe, freshly laundered. His hair is tied back. He has not spoken in hours. Another man kneels behind him to his left, perfectly still, one hand resting on the hilt of his own blade. The man at the table picks up the brush, dips it carefully, and begins to write. Each stroke is deliberate. He does not pause or correct. When the poem is finished, he sets the brush down, folds the paper once, and places it beside the stand. He reaches for the wakizashi. The second man shifts his weight slightly, preparing. You understand what comes next, even if you do not see it. The cut is made, the discipline is proven. The second ends it cleanly. It is over. Seppuku was not a punishment in the sense of torture or public humiliation. It was an exit reserved for samurai who had violated their obligations in ways that could not be overlooked, but whose rank still commanded a degree of respect. A samurai caught embezzling domain funds, fleeing from duty, or dishonoring his lord might be ordered to take his own life, rather than face arrest and execution like a common criminal. To die by one's own hand, following a prescribed ritual, demonstrated courage, self-control, and acceptance of responsibility. The presence of a kaishakunin, a second who would deliver the final blow, was a mercy. The kaishakunin's blade ensured the ordeal lasted only moments. Records from the period treat the practice as unremarkable, a standard administrative measure. Domain officials kept logs noting the date, the offense, the samurai's name, and the kaishakunin's identity. The body was returned to the family for burial. The matter was closed. Some modern accounts romanticize the ritual, emphasizing loyalty and honor. Tokugawa records suggest it was more often about maintaining hierarchy and avoiding scandal. A public trial would have been messy, expensive, and damaging to the domain's reputation. Seppuku was tidy. The air inside the room is cool now, still. Your breath is steady. The tatami beneath you holds no warmth. Rest here a moment longer. For crimes that fell outside the boundaries of rank and decorum, authorities employed methods considerably less tidy. Arson, for instance, was treated with particular severity. Edo burned regularly. The city was built of wood and paper, packed tight, and a single fire could consume entire wards before it exhausted itself. Arsonists, once caught, faced haritsuk, a form of public crucifixion that served as both punishment and deterrent. The condemned was bound to a wooden frame in a public square, arms outstretched and left on display for days. Passers-by were encouraged to participate. Officials provided spears. Townspeople took turns stabbing the prisoner, aiming for non-lethal areas to prolong the ordeal. Death came slowly, sometimes over 3 days, depending on the crowd's enthusiasm and the officials' instructions. The body remained on display after death, left to rot as a warning. Patricide, the murder of one's father, carried similar penalties. The family structure was sacred, the foundation of social order, and to kill one's parent was to tear at the fabric of obligation that held the realm together. The punishment had to be visible, prolonged, and unmistakable. Other severe crimes invited variations. Dismemberment, beheading, or being sawn in half, though the latter was rare and sources conflict on how widely it was practiced. Exile was common for mid-tier offenses. Permanent banishment to remote islands, often with a tattooed face to ensure the exile could never return unnoticed. For lesser crimes, flogging, confinement in wooden stocks, or forced labor on public works projects, the system was not arbitrary. Magistrates followed detailed legal codes that specified punishments for hundreds of offenses, from theft and assault to gambling, adultery, and religious heterodoxy. Sentences were meant to be proportional, though proportionality in Tokugawa terms often looked harsh by later standards. A thief might lose a hand. A repeat offender might lose his life. The goal was not rehabilitation. It was correction, deterrence, and the maintenance of a visible order that everyone could see and understand. Cold settles into the space around you. Stone walls somewhere nearby hold the chill, and the air tastes faintly of damp earth. Your shoulders drop. You stand in the corner of a textile merchant's shop in the Nihonbashi district, mid-morning spring. The space is narrow, perhaps 10 feet across, the walls lined floor to ceiling with bolts of fabric, cotton in undyed grays and browns, rough hemp, occasional glimpses of patterned silk tucked higher up where customers cannot easily reach. The merchant sits behind a low counter, his account ledger open in front of him, an abacus to his right. A customer kneels across from him, a woman in her 40s, her robe plain but well kept. She has come to settle her household's account, and the merchant is walking her through each entry: cloth purchased in the 2nd month, thread in the 4th, a length of hemp in the 7th. His finger moves down the columns. The woman nods at each item, her face neutral. She produces a small cloth purse and counts out coins, stacking them carefully on the counter. The merchant counts them again, sliding each one across the wood with a fingertip. He makes a notation in the ledger, brushes a seal with ink, presses it beside her name. She bows, rises, and leaves. The merchant returns to his ledger. 3 more customers wait outside. He will see each one in turn, and the ledger will grow longer, and at month's end he will tally everything and report a portion to the ward officials, who will pass it up the chain. Nothing in this process is optional. Commerce in Tokugawa, Japan moved along tightly regulated channels. The shogunate recognized that merchants, despite their low social rank, controlled the flow of goods and credit that kept cities functioning. Rice moved from rural domains to urban markets. Textiles, ceramics, tools, paper, tea, salt, and soy sauce circulated through networks of wholesalers, brokers, and retailers, each taking a margin, each keeping records. Guilds controlled access to trades and set prices. The shogunate licensed these guilds, collected fees, and stepped in when monopolies became too blatant, or when inflation threatened stability. Merchants were not trusted. Sumptuary laws forbade them from wearing silk or building ostentatious homes, even when they could afford both. They were expected to display humility, to bow lower, to keep their wealth quiet. Many ignored these rules when they could, and officials periodically cracked down, confiscating assets, imposing fines, or exiling the most flagrant offenders. But the system needed them. Samurai stipends were paid in rice, not coin, and someone had to convert that rice into money. Merchants handled the conversions, extended credit, and slowly accumulated capital that dwarfed the samurai's fixed incomes. The contradiction was obvious. The lowest-ranked estate held the most liquidity. The highest-ranked often owed them money. The bakufu managed this tension by keeping merchants legally vulnerable, subject to sudden audits, fines, or confiscations that reminded everyone where real power lay. Foreign trade was a different matter entirely. The shogunate had closed most ports in the early 17th century, expelling Portuguese traders, banning Christianity, and restricting foreign contact to a single Dutch trading post on a man-made island in Nagasaki harbor. Chinese merchants were permitted limited access. Everyone else was turned away. The policy was deliberate. Foreign contact brought foreign ideas, and foreign ideas brought instability. The Dutch were tolerated because they expressed no interest in converting anyone, submitted to humiliating restrictions, and brought goods the shogunate valued: glassware, clocks, medical texts, telescopes. Each year the Dutch factor traveled to Edo to present gifts and report on events in Europe. The shogunate absorbed this information, filed it away, and changed nothing. Isolation was policy, not accident. Smoke drifts from somewhere nearby, wood smoke, faint and steady. The smell settles into fabric, into hair. Your hands rest at your sides. You do not need to move. Food in Edo was a study in monotony, punctuated by occasional luxury. Rice was the staple, the measure of wealth, the basis of every meal. Polished white rice for those who could afford it, brown rice, barley, or millet for those who could not. Meals were built around rice, accompanied by miso soup, pickled vegetables, and small portions of fish or tofu. Meat was rare, technically forbidden by Buddhist dietary restrictions, though wild game occasionally appeared in rural areas under euphemistic names. Edo's fish markets were legendary, supplied daily by boats from the bay, selling fresh tuna, mackerel, sardines, eel, shellfish. Sushi, in its earliest form, was a method of preservation: fish packed in fermented rice, left for weeks, the rice discarded and the fish eaten. By the mid-Tokugawa period, vendors had begun serving fresh fish on vinegared rice, a faster preparation that suited the city's pace. Street stalls sold noodles, grilled fish, rice balls wrapped in seaweed. The shogunate periodically issued edicts against extravagance in dining, capping the number of courses at banquets, forbidding gold leaf on food, limiting the size of serving dishes. These edicts were ignored by anyone with money, obeyed by everyone else, and reissued whenever officials felt the need to assert control. Sake flowed through the city in steady streams, produced in rural breweries and shipped to Edo in massive quantities. Quality varied. The best sake was clear, fragrant, served warm or cool depending on season. The worst was rough and sour, drunk anyway. Drunkenness was common, tolerated, and occasionally punished when it led to brawls or public disturbances. The shogunate taxed sake production heavily. Brewers passed the cost to consumers, who paid without complaint. Drinking was social glue, a way to endure long winters, celebrate festivals, and forget, briefly, the weight of obligation. The air is stale now, thick and unmoving. Dust coats the surfaces around you, soft and undisturbed. Let it settle. Let everything settle. You kneel on the wooden floor of a small temple in a residential ward, early evening, late autumn. The space is dim, lit by 2 or 3 candles near the altar. The smell of incense is heavy, sweet and cloying, catching in your throat. A bronze Buddha sits in shadow on a raised platform, flanked by smaller statues you cannot quite make out. An elderly woman kneels to your left, her hands pressed together, her lips moving silently. A younger man stands near the entrance, waiting. The priest appears from a side room, his robes dark and worn smooth at the hem. He carries a scroll and a brush. He kneels at a low writing desk, unrolls the scroll, and asks the woman for her family name, her ward, the names of her household members. She answers quietly. He writes each detail in careful columns. When he finishes, he asks if there have been any births, deaths, or marriages since the last registry. She reports a grandson born in the 6th month. The priest adds the entry, dates it, and applies his seal. He rolls the scroll, sets it aside, and moves to the next family. This happens every year, in every temple, across every domain. The temples keep the records, the officials collect them, everyone is accounted for. Buddhism in Tokugawa, Japan, was less a matter of personal faith than administrative necessity. The shogunate had outlawed Christianity in the early 17th century, viewing it as a destabilizing foreign import, and required every household to register with a Buddhist temple. The temple issued certificates proving the family was not Christian, and these certificates were checked regularly by domain officials. Families paid fees to their assigned temple, attended ceremonies, and had their dead buried or cremated according to Buddhist rites. Priests maintained registries that tracked births, deaths, marriages, and movements between wards. The system was surveillance dressed as piety. Most people accepted it without much thought. Buddhism had been woven into daily life for centuries. Funerals, memorial services, ancestor veneration, all of this fell under the temple's purview. The theological details mattered less than the social function. You registered, you paid, you appeared when expected, and the priests filed the paperwork. Shinto coexisted alongside Buddhism, occupying a different register. Shinto shrines dotted the landscape, dedicated to kami, the spirits inhabiting natural features, ancestors, or abstract forces. People visited shrines to pray for good harvests, safe childbirth, protection from illness, success in business. Festivals honored local kami with processions, music, offerings of rice wine, and food. The shogunate did not regulate Shinto the way it regulated Buddhism. Shrines required no registration, kept no official records, and posed no obvious threat. The line between the two traditions was porous. Many families observed both, visiting shrines for life events and temples for death rites. Confucianism provided a third layer, not a religion, but a moral and political philosophy that shaped education, government, and ideas about hierarchy, loyalty, and filial duty. The Bakufu promoted Confucian principles because they reinforced obedience and social order. Scholars debated the finer points. Everyone else absorbed the basic lessons: respect your elders, obey your superiors, know your place. Mud clings to the edge of your sandals, cold and thick. The ground beneath you is uneven, softened by weeks of damp. Your legs ache faintly. Shift your weight. You are allowed to rest. Superstition threaded through all of this, unexamined and ubiquitous. Certain days were auspicious for travel or construction. Others were inauspicious, best spent indoors. The direction you faced when sleeping mattered. So did the arrangement of objects in a room, the offerings left at roadside shrines, the charms purchased from temples and tied to clothing or doorways. Illness was attributed to spiritual imbalance, angry kami, or curses. Some afflictions required prayers and purification rituals. Others called for a physician, though the line between medicine and ritual was not always clear. Medicine in Tokugawa Japan drew from Chinese traditions, supplemented by limited Dutch texts smuggled through Nagasaki. Physicians diagnosed illness by examining the pulse, the tongue, the quality of the patient's qi. Treatments included herbal remedies, acupuncture, moxibustion, and dietary adjustments. A physician might prescribe ginseng for fatigue, willow bark for fever, powdered rhino horn for impotence, though the efficacy of that last one was debatable even then. Wealthier patients could afford consultations with respected physicians who had studied classical texts and maintained reputations for successful treatments. Poorer patients relied on local herbalists, folk remedies, or simply endured. Surgery was rare and dangerous. Dissection of human bodies was forbidden until the mid-18th century, when a handful of physicians, inspired by Dutch anatomical drawings, began to push for reform. Their efforts faced resistance from both religious authorities and colleagues who considered Western knowledge suspect. Progress was slow, incremental, and often ignored outside a small circle of intellectuals in Edo and Nagasaki. Smallpox swept through cities periodically, killing children and disfiguring survivors. There was no effective treatment. Families quarantined the sick, burned mugwort to purify the air, and prayed. Tuberculosis was common, chronic, and fatal. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Parasites were endemic. Life expectancy hovered somewhere in the 30s or 40s, though samurai and wealthy merchants often lived longer, their diets better, their homes less crowded. Infant mortality was high. Women died in childbirth. Infections that would be trivial in later centuries killed without warning. The population remained relatively stable, not because people were healthy, but because high birth rates roughly balanced high death rates. The walls around you are rough stone, damp to the touch and slightly cold. A faint staleness hangs in the air, old and undisturbed. Your breath comes easily. You have no need to hurry. You stand at the edge of a public square in the Asakusa district, midday summer. The heat is oppressive, pressing down on the crowd that has gathered in loose clusters around the square's perimeter. In the center, raised on a wooden platform, a man sits bound in a wooden stock. His head and hands protrude through holes in the thick planks. His face is sunburned, streaked with dirt. A placard hangs above him, listing his crime, gambling. He has been here since dawn. He will remain until sunset. Children throw pebbles. Adults walk past without stopping, though some pause long enough to read the placard and nod. A guard sits in the shade nearby, half asleep. No one speaks to the man in the stock. No one offers water. By late afternoon, his head droops forward. The crowd has thinned. The guard remains. The sun moves slowly across the sky, and when it finally drops below the roofline, the guard rises, unlocks the stock, and the man stumbles away. He will not gamble again, or at least not where he can be caught. Public shaming was a cornerstone of Tokugawa justice, efficient and visible, requiring minimal infrastructure. Stocks were set up in busy squares, outside magistrate offices, near markets. Offenders were displayed for hours or days, depending on the severity of the crime. Petty theft might earn half a day. Fraud or persistent gambling could mean 3 days, exposed to weather, insults, and the casual cruelty of passers-by. The humiliation was the punishment. Everyone in the ward would know. The offender's family would know. Future employers would know. The stocks required no guards beyond a single official to unlock them at the end of the sentence. The system relied on shame, and shame was abundant. Flogging was another common sentence, administered in public or within the magistrate's compound. The offender was tied to a post, and a designated official delivered the prescribed number of blows with a bamboo rod or leather strap, 50 lashes for assault, 100 for repeat theft. The beating was methodical, counted aloud, witnessed by officials who recorded the punishment in their logs. Offenders were released afterward, often unable to walk without assistance. Some died from infection in the days that followed. Most survived, scarred and warned. Exile served as a middle-tier punishment, harsher than flogging but less final than execution. The shogunate maintained several remote islands specifically for this purpose. Offenders were transported by ship, often in chains, and deposited on barren stretches of rock where they would live out their remaining years, fishing, farming marginal plots, and enduring isolation. Authorities tattooed exiles' faces before transport, ensuring they could never slip back into society unnoticed. Some islands developed small communities of exiles who built rough shelters, shared resources, and created a kind of life from nothing. Others were simply dumping grounds where the weak died quickly and the strong lasted a few more seasons. The shogunate did not concern itself with conditions on the islands. Exile meant removal, and removal was the point. Smoke drifts across the square now. Charcoal smoke from a food stall somewhere behind you. The smell is sharp and familiar. Your throat is dry. Swallow once. You are still here. For crimes involving betrayal of trust, embezzlement by officials, or corruption within the samurai class, the shogunate employed investigation methods that were as much theater as procedure. Accused individuals were summoned to the magistrate's office, questioned at length, and asked to produce records, witnesses, and explanations. If the evidence was inconclusive, torture was an option, though the word used in official documents was questioning under duress. Suspension from a beam, arms bound behind the back, weight added to the legs. Crushing of fingers or toes with wooden blocks tightened by screws. Confinement in a wooden box too small to sit or stand, left for days without food or water. Once a confession was obtained, the torture stopped, the confession was recorded, and sentencing proceeded. Magistrates understood that confessions obtained this way were often unreliable, but the system valued closure and the appearance of certainty over the messiness of ambiguity. A signed confession allowed the case to be closed, the punishment administered, and the records filed. The legal system itself was labyrinthine, layered with protocols, hierarchies, and unwritten rules that governed who could be tried where and by whom. Samurai accused of crimes were judged by their own domain officials, not by town magistrates. Commoners fell under the jurisdiction of town or village magistrates who held court in Spartan rooms where the accused knelt on bare floors and the magistrate sat elevated behind a desk. Trials were not adversarial. There were no defense attorneys, no juries, no presumption of innocence. The magistrate reviewed the evidence, questioned the accused and any witnesses, consulted legal codes, and issued a verdict. The process could take days or months. Serious cases were referred upward to higher officials, sometimes reaching the shogun's council if they involved political implications or high-ranking individuals. The councils deliberated in secret, and their decisions were final. Once a sentence was handed down, it was carried out. Exceptions were rare, usually involving cases where new evidence surfaced or where powerful patrons intervened behind the scenes. For everyone else, the system moved in one direction: accusation, investigation, judgment, punishment, bomb. The crowd around you has thinned. The heat lingers, baking into stone and wood. You feel the weight of cloth against your skin, damp at the collar. Breathe. Let your shoulders drop. Nothing requires your attention. You are walking along the Tokaido, the Great Eastern Road connecting Edo to Kyoto, late morning in early spring. The road is packed earth, wide enough for 2 palanquins to pass with care, rutted from recent rain, but mostly dry now. Pine trees line both sides, their branches forming intermittent shade. Ahead of you, a line of porters carries bundles strapped to wooden frames on their backs, moving at a steady trudge. Behind you, a samurai on horseback approaches slowly, his attendants walking beside him. You step aside to let him pass. He does not acknowledge you. The porters do not look up. A checkpoint station appears ahead, a low building with a barrier gate across the road. Guards in plain jackets sit outside, watching travelers approach. You join the line forming at the gate. A merchant ahead of you presents his travel permit, a folded paper stamped with official seals. The guard examines it without urgency, checks the merchant's face against a description written on the permit, asks his destination. The merchant answers. The guard waves him through. Your turn comes. You present your own permit. The guard glances at it, glances at you, nods. The gate lifts. You continue. Travel within Tokugawa, Japan was regulated, monitored, and deliberately inconvenient. The shogunate maintained a network of checkpoints along major roads, staffed year-round by officials who inspected travel permits, checked cargo, and watched for anyone attempting to bypass the system. First, to prevent daimyo from moving armies or weapons toward Edo. Second, to stop women from leaving Edo without authorization, particularly the wives and children of daimyo held as hostages under the Sankin Kotai system. Third, to control the flow of people generally, ensuring that peasants remained in their villages, merchants stayed within their licensed zones, and samurai did not wander without their lord's permission. Obtaining a permit meant petitioning local officials, stating your purpose, providing references, and waiting for approval. The process could take days or weeks. Once approved, the permit listed your name, your destination, your reason for travel, and the expected duration. Guards at checkpoints compared your appearance to the description on the permit. Discrepancies meant delays, additional questions, sometimes detention. The roads themselves were well maintained near Edo and Kyoto, less so in remote provinces. The shogunate required each domain to maintain the sections of road within its borders, a task domains resented but could not refuse. Post stations dotted the major routes at intervals of a few miles, offering lodging, food, stables, and porters for hire. These stations were licensed by the bakufu, which set maximum prices for rooms and meals and audited the station managers periodically. Travelers could expect a small room with a tatami floor, a futon, basic meals, and a bath if they were lucky. Samurai paid less than merchants. Commoners paid more than either. Porters and laborers slept in communal rooms or outside under eaves. The Tokaido was the busiest route, traveled by daimyo processions, merchants transporting goods, pilgrims heading to shrines, messengers carrying official documents, and entertainers moving between cities. The Sankin Kotai system required daimyo to spend alternate years in Edo, and each journey involved hundreds of retainers, porters, guards, and attendants arranged in strict hierarchical order. The processions announced the daimyo's status, displayed his wealth, and consumed enormous resources. Domains competed to outdo each other, commissioning ornate palanquins, silk banners, and matching livery for attendants. The costs were crippling, which was precisely the point. A daimyo bankrupted by travel expenses had no funds left to challenge the shogunate. Vermin scuttle in the dry grass beyond the road's edge. Too quick to see clearly, the sun presses on your neck and shoulders. Your feet ache. Sit for a moment if you need to. The road will still be there. Rivers posed another obstacle. The shogunate forbade the construction of bridges over major rivers along the Tokaido, forcing travelers to ford at designated crossings or hire porters to carry them. The logic was military. Bridges allowed armies to move quickly. Fords slowed them down. At each major river, a station provided porters who waded through the current, carrying passengers on their shoulders or in portable platforms. The price depended on the river's depth and the season. Travelers waited days for water levels to drop, crowding into nearby inns, paying inflated prices, and complaining to officials who nodded and did nothing. The system was intentional. Inconvenience was control. Sea travel was faster but restricted. Coastal shipping moved rice, textiles, and bulk goods between domains. But the shogunate limited the size of ships, banned multi-masted vessels, and prohibited construction of ocean-going craft. The fear was foreign contact and the possibility of daimyo acquiring ships capable of projecting power. Rivers and canals carried cargo inland, hauled along by bargemen who lived on their boats and worked routes their families had worked for generations. Travel by water was cheaper than overland transport, but only merchants and officials with proper documentation could arrange it. Ordinary travelers walked. Silence stretches along the road now. The procession has passed. The porters are distant specks. Even the birds have stopped calling. The heat sits heavy, unmoving. Close your eyes if you need to. Let the silence hold you. You sit on a wooden bench outside a kabuki theater in the Yoshiwara district, evening midsummer. The street is crowded, loud with voices and the clatter of clogs on stone. Lanterns hang from eaves, casting uneven light. The theater entrance is draped with banners announcing tonight's performance, the actors' names written in bold calligraphy. A line has formed, men and women in their best clothing, some with servants holding umbrellas though there is no rain. You watch a group of young men push toward the front, laughing, already drunk. A theater attendant in a dark coat stops them, gestures toward the back of the line. They argue briefly, then comply. The doors open. The crowd surges forward. Tickets are checked, and people funnel into the narrow entrance. Inside, you hear music starting, the sharp notes of a shamisen, drums, voices calling over one another. The performance will run for hours. People will eat, drink, talk through the quiet scenes, cheer during the dramatic ones. No one expects silence. The theater is not a shrine. Kabuki was spectacle, commerce, and controlled transgression all at once. The shogunate permitted it, but regulated it heavily, confining theaters to specific districts, censoring scripts, and banning women from performing after deciding that their presence encouraged licentiousness. Male actors took all roles, including female ones, and the best onagata, specialists in women's roles, were celebrities whose movements, voices, and mannerisms were studied and imitated. Audiences came for the drama, the costumes, the elaborate stage effects, trapdoors, revolving platforms, actors flying on wires. They also came to see and be seen, to display new clothing, to gossip, to flirt, to conduct business in the intermissions. The shogunate worried about Kabuki's influence, issuing periodic edicts against extravagant costumes, limiting ticket prices, and reminding theater owners that performances should not mock authority or depict recent political events. Theater owners nodded, made minor adjustments, and continued. Kabuki was too popular, too profitable, and too embedded in urban culture to suppress entirely. Yoshiwara, the licensed pleasure quarter in Edo, operated under similar logic. Prostitution was legal within its walls, illegal everywhere else, and the distinction was enforced. The quarter was surrounded by a moat and a high fence with a single guarded gate. Visitors entered, paid for the company of courtesans or lower-ranked prostitutes, spent the night, and left in the morning. The courtesans, at the top of the hierarchy, were educated, trained in music, poetry, calligraphy, and conversation. They entertained wealthy merchants and high-ranking samurai in elegant rooms, their fees astronomical, their reputations carefully managed. Lower-ranked women worked in smaller establishments, saw more clients, earned less, and aged out quickly. The quarter had its own economy, its own social structure, its own rules. The shogunate taxed it, licensed it, and looked the other way as long as violence stayed contained, and diseases did not spread too obviously into the broader population. Public gaze governed much of daily life in Edo, where density made privacy nearly impossible. Neighborhoods were organized into groups of 5 households, each group collectively responsible for the behavior of its members. If one household harbored a criminal, all 5 faced punishment. This system, the goningomi, ensured constant surveillance, not by officials but by neighbors who had every incentive to watch, report, and intervene. Anonymity was difficult. Everyone knew who lived where, who worked where, who had guests, who spent too much, who failed to pay debts. Gossip spread faster than official edicts. Reputation mattered more than wealth, and once lost, it could not be recovered. A quiet murmur rises from the crowd still lingering outside the theater. The heat has not broken. Smoke from cooking stalls drifts past, carrying the smell of grilled fish and sweet rice cakes. You are thirsty, you are tired. Let both be true without fixing either. Censorship extended beyond theaters into publishing, woodblock prints, and popular literature. The shogunate employed censors who reviewed manuscripts, examined prints, and banned anything deemed subversive, obscene, or critical of authority. Publishers worked around these restrictions with subtle adjustments, changing names, setting stories in distant historical periods, using allegory. Readers understood the codes. A story about a corrupt official in the Heian period might be commentary on a current magistrate. Censors knew this too, but unless the connection was explicit, they let it pass. The system was a negotiation, not a wall. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige produced landscape prints that circulated widely, celebrated Edo's beauty, and occasionally smuggled in sly social commentary through composition or caption. The shogunate tolerated this because the prints were popular, profitable, and mostly harmless. Festivals provided another outlet, sanctioned occasions for noise, drinking, and temporary inversion of social norms. Neighborhoods organized their own festivals tied to local shrines, featuring processions. Portable shrines carried through streets by groups of men chanting and drinking, food stalls, games, fireworks. During festivals, commoners could wear brighter colors. Samurai relaxed their usual severity, and everyone participated. The shogunate encouraged festivals because they reinforced community bonds, honored tradition, and released tension. A population allowed to celebrate periodically was less likely to riot. The festivals were carefully scheduled, their routes approved in advance, their duration limited. When they ended, order resumed. Sumo wrestling occupied a curious space, part sport, part ritual, part entertainment. Matches were held in temporary wooden arenas, attended by crowds that included samurai, merchants, artisans, and laborers. Wrestlers were ranked in strict hierarchies, their bouts governed by elaborate ceremony and unwritten codes of conduct. A match could end in seconds or drag on for minutes. Spectators gambled, cheered, threw coins into the ring for victorious wrestlers. The shogunate licensed sumo organizations, regulated matches, and occasionally banned bouts when violence spilled into the audience. But sumo endured because it was native, non-threatening, and useful. Tournaments gave unemployed samurai something to watch, and young men from rural areas a path to fame and income if they were large and skilled enough. The air feels heavier now, thicker, as though the city is holding its breath. Your legs are stiff, shift your weight, stand if you need to. The night continues without urgency. You kneel on the floor of a single-room tenement in the Fukagawa ward, night, winter. The walls are thin wood and paper, patched in places with scraps of cloth. The floor is bare boards, no tatami, cold enough that you feel it through your clothing. A small brazier sits in the corner, glowing weakly, its charcoal nearly spent. A family of 4 lives here. A man, his wife, 2 children, asleep under a shared quilt in the far corner. The man sits by the brazier, holding his hands near the embers. His wife is mending a jacket by the dim light, her needle moving slowly, precisely. Neither speaks. Outside, you hear coughing from the next room, footsteps on the stairs, a baby crying 2 buildings over. The walls are thin enough that every sound carries. Privacy is a concept that does not apply here. The man shifts, pulls his jacket tighter, and stares at the coals. His wife ties off a thread, folds the jacket, and sets it aside. She will begin again tomorrow. There is always something that needs mending. Housing in Edo ranged from spacious samurai estates with multiple rooms, gardens, and retainer quarters, down to tenements where entire families occupied single rooms and shared wells, toilets, and courtyards with dozens of neighbors. Rent consumed a significant portion of income. Landlords collected monthly, evicting anyone who fell behind. Tenements were built quickly, cheaply, and packed tightly into wards that burned regularly and were rebuilt just as quickly. Edo burned so often that residents spoke of it as a seasonal event, almost expected. When a fire started, people grabbed what they could carry and fled. Firefighting brigades, organized by ward and funded by merchants, attempted to create fire breaks by tearing down buildings in the fire's path, but the blazes often moved faster than the brigades could respond. After each fire, rebuilding began immediately. Carpenters, plasterers, and laborers descended on the burned zones, contracts in hand, and within weeks new tenements stood where the old ones had been. Water came from communal wells, drawn by hand, carried in buckets. Bathing happened in public bathhouses, neighborhood fixtures where men and women bathed separately in large wooden tubs filled with water heated by wood-fired boilers. The bathhouses were social spaces, places to gossip, relax, and warm up during winter months. Samurai and wealthy merchants had private baths in their homes, but everyone else queued at the bathhouse in the evening, paid a small fee, scrubbed in an outer area, and soaked in the communal tub. The water was changed once or twice a day. By evening, it was cloudy and tepid. No one complained. It was still warmer than home. Toilets were communal pits or simple wooden structures built over cesspits, shared by multiple households. Waste was collected by professionals who sold it to farmers as fertilizer, creating a circular economy that connected city and countryside. The collection happened at night, the carts moving through narrow alleys, the smell unmistakable. Residents paid a small fee or simply allowed the collectors to take what they needed. The system worked because everyone understood their role and because alternatives were worse. Cold presses in now from all sides. The brazier's light barely reaches you. Somewhere a shutter rattles in the wind. Your hands are stiff. Curl them gently, then release. You are still here. You are safe. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, rats, and mice were facts of life, not problems to be solved but conditions to be managed. People picked lice from hair and clothing, set traps for rats, burned herbs to discourage fleas, and accepted that eradication was impossible. Wealthier households fared better, their homes cleaner, their clothing changed more often, but even they could not eliminate pests entirely. In tenements where multiple families lived wall to wall, infestations spread quickly and persisted indefinitely. Children grew up scratching bites, learning to sleep through the scurrying of rats in the walls, and understanding that complaint achieved nothing. Clothing was mended, re-dyed, patched, taken apart and reassembled, passed down through generations until the fabric disintegrated. Cotton was the standard for commoners, hemp for the poorest. Silk was restricted by sumptuary laws, though wealthy merchants wore it anyway, hidden under plain outer layers. Colors were regulated. Commoners were forbidden from wearing purple, bright red, or patterns that mimicked samurai crests. Inspectors occasionally swept through markets, confiscating garments that violated these rules, though enforcement was inconsistent. People learned to navigate the restrictions, dyeing fabric in permitted shades, choosing patterns that skirted the edge of legality, wearing forbidden items only indoors or in districts where inspectors rarely appeared. Daily life moved to rhythms dictated by light, season, and market schedules. Most people rose before dawn, worked through the morning, paused briefly for a midday meal, continued until evening, and slept soon after dark. Candles and oil lamps were expensive. Moonlight and starlight sufficed when the sky was clear. During winter, days contracted, and people spent long hours indoors, huddled near braziers, doing handwork that required minimal light. Summer brought heat, humidity, insects, and longer working hours. Typhoons swept through in late summer, tearing roofs off buildings, flooding low-lying wards and forcing residents to rebuild. Earthquakes struck without warning, shaking buildings, toppling walls, sparking fires. Edo was built on unstable ground, and everyone knew it. Buildings were designed to flex, not resist. When the shaking stopped, people emerged, assessed the damage, and began repairs. Hunger was common, especially among laborers and the urban poor. Rice prices fluctuated with harvests, and when crops failed, prices spiked. The shogunate maintained emergency rice stores and distributed rations during famines, but the distribution was slow, uneven, and insufficient. People turned to cheaper grains, barley, millet, buckwheat. Street vendors sold thin gruel flavored with scraps of vegetable or fish. Malnutrition weakened resistance to disease, and outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and influenza swept through crowded wards regularly. The sick stayed home if they could afford to, worked through illness if they could not. Physicians were expensive, herbal remedies were cheaper but unreliable. Most illnesses resolved on their own or killed quickly. There was no middle ground. Staleness settles into the room, the air unmoving and dense. The coals have dimmed to almost nothing. Your breath is shallow. Deepen it once, slowly. You carry nothing that is not yours. You sit in a narrow room in a boarding house near the Sumida River, afternoon, early autumn. The room belongs to a man in his 70s, a former porter who can no longer lift heavy loads. He sits across from you, his back bent, his hands gnarled and stiff from decades of work. His bedding is rolled in the corner. A single low table holds a teacup, a pipe, and a small stack of coins. He speaks slowly, his voice thin but steady. He tells you he worked the docks for 50 years, carried rice bales, lumber, bolts of cloth. His shoulders gave out first, then his knees. He has a son somewhere in Osaka, married, working as a clerk. They have not spoken in years. The man receives a small stipend from a neighborhood mutual aid group, enough for rent and 2 meals a day. He spends his mornings at a nearby tea house, his afternoons here. He does not complain. He recounts his working years with the same flat tone he uses to describe the weather. When he finishes, he refills his pipe, lights it with a taper from the brazier, and stares at the wall. You understand that this is what remains: a small room, a few coins, the memory of labor, and the long, quiet hours before the end. Aging in Tokugawa, Japan was not romanticized. Those who lived into their 60s or 70s had survived disease, accidents, famines, and the grinding attrition of manual labor. Their value diminished as their strength failed. Farmers who could no longer work the fields became dependents, cared for by sons or daughters if family bonds held, ignored or resented if they did not. Urban laborers faced similar trajectories. Once their bodies gave out, income stopped. Savings, if they existed, were small and depleted quickly. Mutual aid groups, organized by neighborhood or trade guild, provided modest stipends to elderly members, enough to stave off starvation but not much more. The fortunate had children who honored filial obligations. The unfortunate ended up in temples or shrines that accepted the elderly poor, offering basic shelter and meals in exchange for menial tasks or prayers. Samurai who aged out of active service received pensions, usually a fraction of their original stipend, and spent their final years in modest retirement, advising younger relatives, writing memoirs, or pursuing hobbies like calligraphy or poetry. Their status protected them from destitution, though financial pressures were common. Many samurai families lived beyond their means, maintaining appearances while privately struggling with debt. An aging samurai without heirs faced a precarious future. Adoption was common. a way to ensure someone would perform ancestor rites and maintain the family name. The adoptee, often a nephew or a younger son from a collateral branch, inherited the stipend, the name, and the obligation to care for the aging samurai until death. Women's aging followed different patterns. Widows without sons or daughters often became dependents in their husband's family, tolerated but marginal. Some worked as servants, midwives, or caretakers, roles that required experience rather than strength. Elderly women who had worked in the pleasure quarters aged out by their 30s, their options narrowing to menial labor, begging, or entering temples as lay workers. Beauty and youth were commodities with short expiration dates. The night is quiet now, broken only by the faint sound of water lapping against the riverbank somewhere beyond the walls. The cold has settled into your bones, dull and persistent. You do not need to move, just breathe. Death, when it came, was managed through Buddhist ritual. Families held funerals at their registered temple, the body cremated or buried depending on local practice and the family's means. Memorial tablets were placed on household altars, and descendants performed annual rites to honor ancestors. Temples depended on funeral fees, and families paid because failure to do so invited social censure and, some believed, spiritual consequences. The dead were not gone. They remained present, watching, requiring attention. Graves were maintained by descendants, who visited on death anniversaries, left offerings and burned incense. Wealthy families maintained elaborate tombs. Commoners marked graves with simple wooden markers that weathered and disappeared within a generation. Memory lasted as long as someone remembered, and then it faded. The system assumed continuity. Sons would honor fathers, grandsons would honor grandfathers. When that chain broke through lack of heirs or family dissolution, the dead became forgotten, their tablets discarded, their graves abandoned. Legacy for most people was not a matter of monuments or historical record. It was the continuation of a name, the transmission of a trade, the survival of a family line. A carpenter's legacy was his sons learning the craft. A merchant's legacy was a business passed to the next generation. A samurai's legacy was his name entered correctly in domain registers, his stipend transferred without dispute. These were modest ambitions grounded in survival rather than grandeur. Most people understood they would be forgotten within a few generations. The understanding shaped how they lived, pragmatically, focused on immediate obligations, skeptical of abstractions. The Tokugawa system itself was built on the assumption of permanence, a social order so carefully calibrated that it would endure indefinitely. The shogunate maintained detailed records, codified every aspect of life, and enforced stability through surveillance, punishment, and the weight of collective responsibility. For 2.5 centuries, the system held. Then, in the mid-19th century, foreign ships appeared in Japanese harbors, demanding trade, and the assumptions that had sustained the Tokugawa order began to collapse. The punishments, the hierarchies, the travel restrictions, the surveillance, all of it had been designed for a closed system. When the system opened, reluctantly and chaotically, the structures that had seemed permanent revealed themselves as contingent. But that collapse was still decades away from the moment you sit in this small room watching an old man smoke his pipe. The afternoon light fading, the city continuing its routines beyond these walls. For now, the system endures. The checkpoints still inspect permits. The temples still keep their registries. The magistrates still issue sentences. And in a boarding house near the river, an old porter sits quietly, waiting for nothing in particular, his work done, his story told, the rest merely a matter of time. The room is silent. The light is almost gone. Your hands rest in your lap. You have been here long enough. Sleep well.